Okay, looks like we're live. And hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Bell, and I am the author of The Origins of Southern College Football, How an Ivy League Game Became a Dixie Tradition. First, I'd like to thank LSU Press for making this event possible, specifically LB Kovac, who is handling all the technical streaming and so forth today for us. Thank you. Um, They asked me to talk about some of the interesting things I found, and there are many while researching this book. Before I do that, honestly, I want to make a shameless plug for the book if I can, and maybe even a couple of books I've published too through LSU Press. Let me see if I can bring up the screen here. And the book can be purchased. I recommend purchasing it through the lsupress.org site. The last time I checked, they were running a sale of 40% off if you use the promo code O4READHOME at checkout. So that is a substantial discount, and it helps out LSU Press, which is great. Or if it's more convenient, you can buy it through Amazon. So it is listed there. I appreciate it. I know, despite what you've heard, most of us who write books don't get rich doing so. So any sales would be wonderful, and I'd be happy to sign it for you if you want to mail it to me with a I did that for a couple of people with a self-addressed envelope, and I sent it right back to them. So let me know if that's something that interests you, and we can make that happen. So I want to start today's presentation, though, the same way that I start the book, and that is with a quote from a player named William Pudge Heffelfinger. He was a Midwesterner who said about the Southern players that he faced on the gridiron that they play with a reckless abandon or a wild fanaticism that's rarely found in players from other parts of the nation. So when I first encountered this quote, it raised a lot of interesting questions for me as a researcher. And the most obvious one is, why does Heffelfinger's quote seem to ring true? I've been a fan of Southern college football for a long time, and they do seem to play with more of a reckless abandon or wild fanaticism than other players from other parts of the country. So beyond that, the questions I had were, what is there something about the South's culture, its history, its traditions that might help explain this, why it's the region's most popular sport? And moreover, how and when did football get started in the United States in general? And then that includes, of course, the Southern United States. So sort of my academic antennae picked up on this, and I've always been a fan and wanted to write something a little more in depth. So that was my starting point. And as I began reading the existing literature on college football, I found that a lot of the books start in ancient times. I could list off half a dozen titles that do this, but it's, for example, Harpaston was a game played in ancient Greece by primarily the Spartans that we could say, had some semblance to American football. There were goal lines and sidelines, and the object is to advance a animal bladder that's inflated across a line. So we might call that football, or the Romans had their own version called phallus they played. And, as I continued to read, it became clear that virtually every civilization that has ever existed on Earth had some version of a game we could loosely describe as American football or football. I didn't find these discussions to be particularly helpful or illustrative for my purposes. These games are simply too distant in time. We don't have a lot of information on the players or what the rules were. So I chose instead to begin my narrative with football's closest living relatives, and that is the mob games that are still played rather in English towns and villages and have been played there for centuries. Here I have an example of one such game. It's called the Atherston ball game. I apologize for the slow feed here. I think it's going from Zoom to Facebook. It may slow down a bit, but you'll get the idea. This is a game that's played every Shrove Tuesday or Fat Tuesday for those of you from Louisiana in Warwickshire. And the rules are simple. You have to stay on the town's main street and you can't kill anyone. And that's pretty much the only two rules. The winner is the team that has possession of the ball when time expires. So every English town and village had some variation of a ball game especially around Shrove Tuesday or right before Lent. This game has been played there since 1199, by the way. So as most of you know from your elementary school history class, North America was colonized largely by the English in the late 1500s and early 1600s. So these mob games traveled with English settlers to North American towns and villages. Soldiers in both the American Revolution and the Civil War played mob football games when they were not fighting battles. This is a sketch by Winslow Homer before he became a world-renowned painter, incidentally. It's entitled Holiday in Camp. So this is soldiers blowing off steam. It's good, clean fun in their mind. And again, I want to just underline that phrase, mob football. Mob football, as I argue in the book, is the progenitor of modern American football. So mob football then from these villages becomes more organized and codified as it begins to move into secondary and post-secondary schools or high school and college, if you want to put it that way. Schools in England, such as Westminster or Harrow, Eton, Rugby, that's an obvious one. Other English prep schools began to create their own versions of football, which they subsequently took with them to university. And the reason why is pretty straightforward. If I'm a kid from Warwickshire and there's another, from another part of England, we come to the same university, Cambridge, for example, we're playing two different versions. We can't play against each other. So we need a common set of rules, and that begins to develop gradually. At the same time, there are independent clubs, people who aren't in college that are playing games, similar mob football games. And in 1863, as we see here on the chart, the Football Association is formed in London in 1863, the middle of the American Civil War. And by the way, soccer, the word soccer is a derivation of the word association. So it's just a easy way to refer to the Football Association, or FA. These rules are still used by people who play soccer worldwide, incidentally. But a splinter group forms just a few years later called the Rugby Football Union, obviously graduates of Rugby, the school. They considered their version of football a manlier style of play. There was ball tackling or ball carrying and tackling. So the Rugby Football Union is formed and rules are established in 1872. Just a few years after that, the Ivy League schools like Yale, Harvard, Princeton, et cetera, create the Intercollegiate Football Association, or the IFA, in 1876. So that is the forerunner to the NCAA. And the rules start with Rugby Football Union rules, but their rules are quickly added on top of that, especially by Walter Camp, who many of you have probably heard his name before, who attended Yale and is considered the father of American football. So I also threw the NFL's founding date of 1920 on here just for historical perspective, so you know where you are on the timeline. And it's important to emphasize that all football up until 1920 is college football. So college football is one reason it's very popular in the South is because that was the first game, and a lot of the NFL largely ignored Southern communities because they were agricultural and small. It's only really after World War II we start seeing teams like Miami Dolphins and the Atlanta Falcons and so forth as the NFL expands its franchise. So that's a little bit of sort of the academic side of it, if you will. But I want to come back to a question I'd posed earlier, and I'm sure most of you are curious about: when did Southerners begin playing football? And the best answer I have to that is the late 1860s and early 1870s. I found a reference to a game scheduled for October of 1869 between Washington and Lee University, and that's in Lexington, Virginia, and the Virginia Military Institute, which is directly across the street. That game had to be canceled because of bad weather, but had it occurred, it would have not only been the South's first intercollegiate game, it would have been the first intercollegiate game in American history. Instead, that distinction belongs to Rutgers and Princeton University, who played each other a month later, November of 1869. So obviously there's a lot of interest in football in the South very early. The games at Washington Lee incidentally are mob games up until the 1880s when the game begins to be codified. But this picture, by the way, and this shows you how much fun I had looking into this project. You can imagine looking through old photographs like this and getting a big kick out of it. This is the 1897 Washington Lee team. So football by this time is codified, also known as scientific football because it has rules. That was the designation in that era. But you can see these guys have grown their hair out in some cases. That was thought to offer some protection to their noggins, which is amusing to us, but that's what they thought. And of course, I would have been out of luck had I been a player back then. They're also, you can see a few of them here with nose guards. That was a standard piece of protective equipment during that era. So there's a lot more to it that I cover in the book, but I just wanted you to get some sense of when football began. I can tell you with certainty that the first documented, at least at this point, intercollegiate game played in the South was between Washington and Lee and Virginia Military Institute in the autumn of 1873. I found multiple references to those contests. So that's, at the moment, unless we find other sources, that's the definitive answer. So moving ahead or shifting gears, I want to move on to another question I brought up earlier. And what is it about Southern culture, if anything, that makes football such a natural fit in the region? And so some of the things I found, I've compiled a list here. This is by no means comprehensive, but it gives you some idea of where the book goes. It's not just a rote play-by-play compendium, with most rushing yards gained and so forth. There is that in there and scores and so forth and nice anecdotes, but I wanted to make this a broader sort of social and political history. But there's a history of violence in the South, for starters. The South's reliance on indentured servitude, followed by chattel slavery, meant that those labor systems relied on violence. Violence was also part of the South's honor culture, which I explain in the book. Violence was certainly tolerated. It was also a complicated cultural legacy bequeathed by Scots-Irish immigrants who had quite a bit of hostility towards the English and others. So violence has been part of the South from the very beginning. So a violent game would naturally be embraced by people in that region. There's also what I call in the book the Sir Walter Scott effect. Scott was the author of Ivanhoe. Wealthy and well-educated Southerners considered their country to be sort of the last stronghold of aristocratic privilege in the United States. Strangely enough, I know to many people, Southern journalists who were writing about this new game called football in the early 20th century routinely employed Arthurian metaphors when writing about the new sport. So players were padded knights or long-haired knights at the football arena, and they're performing like it's a jousting tournament in front of lovely young women who are escorted by these gallant cavaliers and so forth. So these reports reinforced the idea, the myth of the swashbuckling Southern aristocrat, and thus it boosted football's popularity in a region that had previously identified the game with Northern Ivy League colleges and universities. My next point here, traditional gender roles, and this always surprises some people, I think, but football arrived on the scene in what was perceived as a national masculinity crisis. People believed that the prosperity that was being created by industrialization, the Gilded Age, it was making men weak and soft, particularly students who spent too much time with their noses in books. So football and other extracurricular activities or beyond the curriculum, the standard academic curriculum, were seen as positive. They reinforced traditional gender roles and boosted men's masculinity and toughness. And the South is part of the United States, so it's not immune to that movement. There's also the inferiority complex Southerners had after the Civil War. Of course, losing the Civil War is going to create a massive inferiority complex, but also they watched in awe as industrialization made the northern states and northern people much wealthier and better educated than they were most Southerners in the 19th century, early 20th, are still farmers, just as their fathers and grandfathers had been. So they wanted to emulate Northern ideas and practices. And so this leads into my next point, which is a post-war support in the South for science and modern ideas. A lot of the men who introduced football to Southern colleges were themselves educated at Northern universities. And a good example, perhaps for this audience, would be Dr. Charles Coates, who did a chemistry PhD at Johns Hopkins University, was an expert in the chemistry of sugar, world renowned for that research, but was also a football fan. He picked up football while studying at Johns Hopkins. Strangely, there's a Johns Hopkins nexus, by the way, for a number of these men I'm referencing. Charles Hurdy at Georgia also did a PhD at Johns Hopkins. George Petrie at Auburn also did a PhD at Johns Hopkins. So that was one of the really interesting things I talked about and learned and talked about in one of my chapters in the book. So it's about bringing the South, the new South, up to speed with the rest of the nation. And football is not, in this period, seen as played by dumb jocks. It's America's best and brightest. It's kind of maybe I call it a Kennedy vision of what football is supposed to be. You're tough as nails and smart as a whip is another way I reference it, I think. There's also the idea that it bridges the old South with the new South. Southerners invent college traditions out of whole cloth that pay homage to the old South, even as they capture the energy and spirit of the new South. A great example would be the LSU Tigers. The students decided to name the team the Tigers after the New Orleans Zouaves and the Donaldsonville Cannoneers who fought in the Army of Northern Virginia. So this is a way to pay tribute, but you're also playing a modern game. I talk a lot about the Auburn War Eagle cheer and the background to that it's a tall tale, of course. Auburn fans have many stories of how these things were invented, but one is that a Civil War veteran was in the stands during the Georgia-Auburn game with a pet eagle he'd found on a battlefield in Virginia. Somehow it got loose and flew over the stadium. The fans shouted out War Eagle to rally around it. That's one of their stories, but whether it's true or not, it just means that there's a lot of history involved in these Southern college traditions, which draw communities together and make people feel part of a larger experience than just themselves. And last year, 19th century Americans are just like us, particularly us when we're in quarantine. They're seeking entertainment. Football games are larger than life spectacles. So you can imagine being on a farm and you have to drive up in Mississippi, let's say, you just need to drive up to Oxford on a Saturday and you're going to be entertained for several hours. You get to see people from other communities. It's very much the same as it is today. So there's a lot more to it in the book, but I just wanted to touch on some of the basics, what the cultural roots of why college football is particularly popular in the South, not exclusively, but particularly. So that's sort of more the academic side of it. And I don't want to just today talk to you only about that. I want to have a little bit more fun maybe, or talk about some of the talented teams from the early days of Southern college football. The first team I'll briefly talk about, and I have an entire chapter, by the way, on this, is the 1899 Sewanee Tigers. They're better known as the Iron Men. They were led by Henry Diddy Siebels. Siebels is holding the game ball there up front, seated. They went 12-0 during the 1899 season and won the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Association Championship by beating the University of North Carolina in Atlanta 5-0. That's remarkable, but what's more remarkable still, and the first time I encountered this, my jaw dropped. The Sewanee team played 5 back-to-back road games during the 1899 season over the course of only 6 days. Not only did they play 5 games in 6 days, they won 5 shutout victories. So no athletic director in his right mind is going to schedule 5 road games in 6 days, maybe not even 3 weeks, probably these days. And that's really remarkable by any standard during any era. But sadly, the sports media of the time were fixated on Ivy League and Midwestern programs. So it's kind of the reverse of what it is today. Ivy League teams were considered the powerhouse programs. The media sort of yawned, okay, well, who did Swanee play? There's some Southern teams, that's not a big deal. And so Swanee's remarkable achievement was largely unnoticed until 1961, when a new magazine called Sports Illustrated did a feature story on the Ironmen and their accomplishments. And suddenly the nation discovered or rediscovered this story. And so flash forward to 2012, the College Football Hall of Fame did a Facebook poll asking fans to choose the greatest football team of all time. And Swanee won, was the clear winner, and beat out a lot of great teams, legendary teams, the 61 Alabama Crimson Tide, 71 Nebraska Cornhuskers, and others. So it's, I think, fair to say that the Swanee men are better known, or Ironmen are better known now than they were even in their own time. And I think that would have amused them, because college football at that point is played by rowdy amateurs who have something to prove. It's not about playing for the NFL or some, advertising a deal after you graduate or anything like that. It's just to prove something. They could have not had any idea that it would change Southern culture or redefine even what it meant to be a Southerner. So that's the 1899 Swanee Tigers, or Ironmen. Another of the great teams from the early days would have been the 1917 Georgia Tech Golden Tornado, later renamed the Yellow Jackets, and most people are familiar with that. This is the first Southern team to win a consensus national championship. They went 9-0 under Coach John Heisman. I'm sure you all have heard that name also. Heisman in the back with his arms folded and the sweater. At the risk of alienating Georgia Tech fans, I argue this in the book, and I have to state it during my presentation. There needs to be an asterisk next to this season. And the reason is that a number of top-tier programs, Southern schools such as North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, did not field varsity teams during the 1917 season. And that is because the nation was at war. We declared war on Germany in April of 1917. Moreover, those schools that did field teams, such as Vanderbilt, claimed that their best men had been drafted or were enlisted in the military. And so they were fielding scrub teams for Heisman to beat up on. There certainly were some great victories for Georgia Tech during that season, particularly against Penn, the University of Pennsylvania, Heisman's alma mater, which he knew if he beat Penn, that would attract media attention. But, who knows what would have happened had the country not been at war at that period. And, that's an interesting question for today. What's going to happen with the Big Ten and how the schedules have been set up for this season? Are we going to get a consensus national champion, or is it going to be a different voting for different teams? It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But perhaps this asterisk that I've mentioned is why so many football historians have dubbed the 1926 Rose Bowl as the game, and this is a quote, the game that changed the South. Alabama ekes out a 20-19 victory over the University of Washington in the biggest game of the year. And suddenly Southern football programs are taken very seriously thereafter. I argue in the book that the attention, though, paid to the 25-26 team, Alabama team, and, in the interest of full disclosure, I am an Alabama alumnus, so I don't really want to write this, but I feel obliged to tell the truth about it. The 25-26 Bama team, their success has as much to do with cultural and technological changes of that era as it has to do with Bama's athleticism, which I'm not discounting. And that means a post-war boom in advertising. Advertising is an industry that's virtually created in World War I as a propaganda arm for the federal government by a guy named George Creel. But advertising after World War I, magazine publishing, the proliferation of radio and movies, it creates this cult of celebrity, this massive new audience for sports and stars, people like Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin. And I'm sure everybody's heard of Babe Ruth, Newt Rockne, others. These are products of media hype and new technology. So to be more precise, almost nobody owns a radio in 1920 in the United States, but by the end of the decade, nearly a third of American homes had one. So suddenly a team from Tuscaloosa could draw national public attention through a victory. So the 1899 Swanee team, the 1917 Georgia Tech teams, maybe were just as talented as the 25 Alabama Crimson Tide, but they appear on the historical timeline too early. They can't take advantage of the media hype again and the celebrity worship that are emerging during the Roaring 20s. So that's kind of the skinny of where the book goes and my little overview here. Let me see if I can stop sharing the screen. So reasons why I wrote the book, I'll wrap it up there, and I'll try to answer some of your questions if you have some. Why I wrote this book. First, I'm a fan of college football, Southern college football in particular. As I said, I graduated from the University of Alabama. I was there in the early 90s when we beat Miami in the Sugar Bowl. It was a fantastic time to be there. I remember that year, though, looking at the field, and it said 100 years of Alabama football, 1892 to 1992. And even then, as a callow undergraduate student, I was wondering, what's the significance of that date, and what were the teams like in 1892, and who brought football to Alabama? And I just had a lot of questions that I put on the back burner. I pursued other research topics over the years, getting degrees there and other universities. So this was very much a labor of love in that respect. I came back full circle to something I'm interested in. And I think that's really the only thing you should write about, is things you're passionate about. But second, I wanted to write a sports history that is placed in a broader social and political context. A lot of the books that I read preparing for this one provide a microscopic view of football's origins. You know, we know, again, some of the names of the players and the scores, but what's going on in the country or the world as a whole that might be influencing how this game is shaped. And you know, to be maybe a little more specific on that point, the Gilded Age, the industrial era, is sort of a Wild West, an unregulated business environment in the country. And football very much is an unregulated game during that period. It's a reflection of what's going on in the society as a whole. We move into the progressive era, and we begin to see bureaucracies and committees and rules to make everything safer and more comfortable for middle-class Americans. And football falls right into that. We see the codification of the game and increased safety measures during that period. So just talking about football alone, devoid from any broader historical context, I think does a disservice to the readers. So I've tried to remedy that to the best of my ability. If you buy the book, you'll be the judge of that. And I hope you will, because boy, I need the money, but thank you very much. So I'm gonna take some questions now. Let's see. Okay. Mallory asks, do you think quarantine is going to have, oops, the question disappeared. I'm sorry, Mallory. Let me see if I can get back to it. Oops. Mallory, I'm really trying. Okay. Do you think quarantine is going to have a lasting effect on Southern football? I think they'll be better prepared next time is how I would answer that question. Most of you probably already know that there was a horrific pandemic during the 1918 season, and football was played anyway. And in fact, with the encouragement of the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, Georgia Tech almost won a second national championship. They were defeated by Pop Warner and Pitt that year. So they're going to be better prepared. I think I mean, it'll have some effect. Yes. Is it going to eliminate Southern college football? Absolutely not. And the fans have proven that already this year, even though we're in the throes of an awful epidemic, that, hey, we're going to play. This is part of our life. This is part of our culture. We're going to play. So for better or worse. But all right. And so, Mallory, I hope that answers your question. Let's see. Jenny asked, do any of the football teams from the early days still exist? Well, yes, they do, Jenny. Absolutely. The Alabama Crimson Tide still exist. Is that what, there's still programs at all of these colleges and universities that many of them, by the way, and this is sort of an aside. Walter Camp published his book, his magnum opus, as I call it, College Football in 1891. And so you see teams like South Carolina, like Georgia, like Alabama, There's the first historically black colleges and universities game, Livingston and Biddle in 1892, right after that. Because suddenly there is a Bible you can read to figure out how the game is played. And so this book is taken to campuses across the South. So the answer to that question is yes. Most of the teams that were founded from the early days still exist. Let's see, what else? I'm sorry, this is kind of the way it's presented to me is a little bit weird. I'm really trying to get to your questions the best I can. Okay, so how many games were there in a season during the early days of college football? That really depended on, I mean, there was no standard number. There's no governing body dictating to the colleges and universities how many games they had to play. A lot of it honestly had to do with gate considerations. Okay, how many people can we pull in to this particular game? For example, Swanee went back to Georgia. I believe the second time was to play Georgia Tech, maybe Georgia, but because they were playing good money playing in Piedmont Park in Atlanta. So it really depended. I would say the fewest I've seen in my research was 9 games in a season. So hope that answers the question. When did helmets become a regular part of the football team uniform? A good question. As I said earlier, for a long time, they thought growing your hair out was sufficient protection in that regard. There was a Navy player, Joe Reeves, I believe his name was, who hired a Annapolis shoemaker to construct a crude leather helmet to give him some protection after his doctor said that one more blow to the head would possibly kill him. And he didn't want to give up football, even with that advice from his physician. So you gradually began to see helmets in greater use. And Spalding, which is one of the early companies that figures out it can make money providing football equipment, thereafter begins providing leather helmets once that becomes an established technology. So any other, let me see here. I can see were the striped jerseys really their uniforms? Oh, okay. Jenny, thank you for that. Are you talking about Washington Lee, I assume? Is that right? In their case, absolutely yes. That's the 1897 team. Okay. Yep, that was part of their uniforms, yes. So it's neat. These photographs you can see in any library archives. Many of them I'm certain are posted online. You can even see the old catalogs, the old equipment, which is fun to look at. And Susan Rayburn, for those of you who want, besides my book, which I know you're going to buy, I know everybody's a big fan. There is a coffee table book put out by the Library of Congress. Susan Rayburn was the author. It's just filled with lovely like programs and old photographs and catalogs. And if you're interested in the early days of college football, I recommend that book highly. It's beautifully written and edited. You can buy that one after you buy mine. So, okay. Well, I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I know I'm thinking there are millions of people out there listening, but who knows? Again, please visit lsupress.org and look for my book. And, feel free to email me if you have any other questions, anything like that. And thank you very much for your time and tuning in. I hope, LB, is there anything else I need to do?